Hello, my name is Ger Schuber and I would like to give you an introduction and an overview of the system architecting training, a training that is running a lot well in Europe but also abroad over the world, a very popular training to train what is system architect and the system architect role about. Why is system architecting so important? Well, if you look at the overview of how systems evolve, let's say from mechanical and a little bit of electronics, and where software is being added, systems become more and more complex, especially due to the fact of the multidisciplinary aspect. Adding more disciplines, making it inherently complexer. And we have for sure not hit the end result of that. It becomes more and more complex. The systems will get connected, so the internet is there, security, privacy, all these kind of aspects become important. And all the choices, the technical choices that are being made have a great impact on the success and the value of the systems that we are developing. And that means that the decisions, the technical decisions, the multidisciplinary technical decisions become more and more important. And that's where the systems architect role becomes so very prominent, available in systems. So classical systems engineering has the heritage of coming from the mechanical and electronics engineering, and nowadays when systems become more and more complex and more software oriented, it means that the multidisciplines need prominent decisions there. So if you look at the product creation process in general for systems, it means that it often starts with, hey, who is our customer and what do they want? It's typically a product manager's role who has a close connection to the market world, to the customer world, trying to understand what are the expectations of our customers. What do they want? What do they like to have? What can we give them? And to build such a system, often a project manager here at this end tries to come up with a plan how to develop the system within a certain kind of time period, within a certain kind of, let's say, budget and amount and things like that. But how about the technical decisions, the systems architect role? He is in the middle of both of these ends. At one end the product manager and the other end the product manager. The product manager is typically the one who is involved in getting the ideas on the table, what is the customer wants to have. The architect tries to translate of how can we realize in a product that we can produce, what is the specification of the product that the customer likes to have. That will lead to a product that can be sold, that can be provided to the market. But building it means that we have to put a plan together, the planning of the project. So you see that the systems architect role is more or less the glue between at one end the customer side and at one end and the other end the business side. This training, the system architecting training, tries to cover what a system architect does, who he is or he or she is, what he does, and that's in fact the systems architecting process, the activity that a system architect does on a daily basis. In the end, to come up with a blueprint of the product. The blueprint of the product, the technical blueprint of the product, is in fact the result of the activities that the systems architect does. So that's the systems architecting. So we have the architect being the person, architecting the activity the person does, and the result is the blueprint, the architecture. So this is the terminology of architect, architecting, and architecture. If you look at the systems architecting training, tries to cover all of these aspects. The architect being in the middle at one end, the product manager, and the other end, the project leader or the project manager. So the architecting activities that the systems architect does to come up with this blueprint is based on the input that he gets from, let's say, the customer environment. What are the requirements? What are the wish list of the customer? And how do we get these on the table? So that's in fact the first step of the systems architect, to be able to do the architecting job. And it means that a lot of stakeholders are in place here. So the customer that gives the requirements is not only the end user. It might also be service, it might be maintenance, it might be production. External users, maybe the financial department. And the system architect has to have a good ear listening to all these stakeholders to get a good idea of what the actual needs are. not just creating the product the customer asked for, but what he really needs. That's in fact a very, very important role. And the architecting activities should then lead to this architecture. Requirements are also linked to business drivers, and that is the business drivers of the company, the company that asks for a system. What is the driver, what are the needs, what is let's say the objectives of the customer environment? How is that then translated into requirements, and how will that then lead to the input for the architecting process to come up in the end with the architecture of the system? And it's a multidisciplinary activity, as we see here. It can be various technical disciplines: physics, optics, mechanics, software, electronics. All these kind of things are covered by the architect, trying to come up with a solution that can be integrated in a product that the customer really needs in the end. And what we see here on the top is the kind of reasoning framework, the CAFCR framework, and I'll come back to that a little bit later when I'll explain a bit more the various steps in the systems architecting training. But this in fact tries to cover it. And the end product here, the architecture, that should of course try to realize, to meet these business drivers. And once you have been able to, as an architect, to meet that and to make that equal, that result is equal to the business drivers, then in fact you did a good job. And that's what we try to train in the systems architecting training. For whom is it meant? It is meant, of course, for the people who do the job, who do the technical job and become maybe the architect. And it can have various backgrounds. It can be people from various disciplines. Maybe you have a mechatronics background. Maybe you are from physics or optics or from software. Everyone has his roots somewhere in a kind of an engineering discipline, and that's where you are a specialist and you become more a generalist, trying to cover all these disciplines. So it's typically meant for people who have already made some steps, well, maybe in an engineering discipline, and will become the system architect of a project. Also meant for people who the system architect works together with, maybe with project managers, product managers, maybe group leaders, who need to understand what is the goal of a system architect, what does he do on a day-to-day basis, and how can you work in the best way together with such a person. So this is in fact the target audience for a training like this. So the people who will fulfill the job, but also the people who are in a very close neighborhood of it. Well, here's a drawing that I once made and I use as a kind of a foundation for the systems architecting training. It covers the 5 steps for the full training. And the 5 steps are in fact the 5 days that are covered during this training. So every number is in fact representing one of the days in the 5-day system architecting training. In the center we see, well, a representation of the architect, having the blueprint under his arm. That's the result that the systems architect is after. But very important is what we try to train the people for is that it is, of course, always in the back of our minds that it will lead to value for customer and that it also will lead to, let's say, the value for business. So that's what the systems architect role. Not just coming up with a brilliant kind of idea from technology, but that it always has value for customer and that it has value for business. That's where you will be successful as a company, and that will also make the customers successful. Let's go through the 5 days of this training, and we start off with day number 1. Before I go for day number 1, let's also have a look at what we present. We also offer the book from Gerrit Muller. You see here the book Systems Architecting from a Business Perspective is in fact the basic book that we are using also during the training, and that is also offered for all the people that take part in the training. So that's the foundation, in fact, of all the activities in the training itself. Let's have a look at the various days. I will cover each of these days, and we'll start with day number 1. Day number 1 is trying to zoom in on the processes of the organization and also the tasks and the responsibilities of the systems architect. And I'll take some slides that we'll also use during the training. And this slide, in fact, represents more or less the 4 main processes that you might recognize in an organization. The center part here is the product creation process. That's where most of the time the architect, where the architect spends most of his time. That's where the development is taking place of the next generation of products, which are then passed on to the customer-oriented process. That's the people that work very close together with the customer, like production, like sales, like service. And we have a kind of a foundational process in an organization, a people process and technology management process. That's where the assets of the company is. That's where the knowledge is. That's where the people are. And these people are working in a product creation process, creating a product that will then, in the end, will be delivered to the customer. And here at the upper left corner, we see also the policy and planning process. That's where the management is, trying to have an idea of the mission, the vision, and the direction of the company. And that's where we start off with in day number 1, to get a bit of an idea, hey, how does the organization work? Who are the players in this game? What is the role of each of these players? What's your own role? How do we interact? And what are the rules of the game itself? That's the starting point of day number 1. So we look at the process, we look at the product creation process, which you recognize here in the various steps that we're doing, but also how can it become more concurrent? We are fighting against, let's say, an earlier time to market. We have more complex systems that we try to deliver to the market, and that means that we have to go more in an iterative kind of approach. Maybe starting with requirements, but also learning from, let's say, bottom line technology, some engineering, and maybe some prototyping and simulation, and see how we can have a kind of a concurrent and iterative approach in this process. And that's what we'll cover also on day number 1. The last subject of day number 1 is the typical, let's say, deliverables of the system architect, the responsibilities of the systems architect, and the activities. And that's more or less covered in this, I call it sometimes the iceberg. And if you think of an iceberg, then only the top part of the iceberg is very visible. That's the part that's above the waterline. And the visible part of the systems architect work is maybe the documents, like requirements, design documents, and the tangible parts. But a lot of the things are also underneath of the waterline, and especially the responsibilities, like taking care of the right balance, taking care of overview, that it all, let's say, fits together, coming up with a simple solution, and giving some direction to the team. And that leads to a lot of activities that he does on a day-to-day basis, like communication, informal communication, formal communication, understanding the needs, being able to present it to the technical team, present it to the customers, writing some specs yourselves, maybe you have to review a lot of specs, and maybe also visit, let's say, the various sites that you are working on. So it's deliverables, responsibilities, and at the bottom here, the activities. And that's in fact covering day number 1. Let's go to day number 2. And day number 2 is focusing on, well, often the starting point for the work of the architect. What are the requirements? What is the wish list of the customer? And how do we get these on the table and translate that? And the second subject in the second day is also, how about documentation, and how about modeling and views and the tools of the systems architect? So here's a slide that I took from the requirements elicitation part. The requirement starts often with the what. It's the what of the product. What is that the customer likes to have? How can we translate it in what are we going to realize? So from the wish list, the needs, into the product specification, what are we going to realize? And then a very important step comes, how about the design or the top level architecture? We understand the needs, but how can we break that down into, let's say, system breakdown or system architecture? And that will lead to subsystems, subcomponents, which have their requirements again, and that goes in a kind of a hierarchical breakdown of the total system. And it means that a lot of, let's say, discussions have to be done with the customers. You see here, trade-offs have to be done, how to negotiate what is, well, the customer might have interesting wishes, but can it all be fulfilled? About documentation, a jump into documentation. How can we make the work of documentation that it is much more valuable for the day-to-day activities that the architect does? So instead of, let's say, writing documents of 100 pages, can we put it all together on a one-pager? Can we put it together on one piece of A3 piece of paper? As an example has been given here for a product, in this case a metal printer, and how can we have the most essential stuff of the metal printer here on one A3? Maybe something about the context, how the system, let's say, works, how it works over time, maybe some physical representation, how about, let's say, all kind of key drivers and quantification of it, and maybe something about the processing. maybe this is what the most important discussions are about during the product creation process that the architect is working on. And instead of, or maybe additional to having thick documents, maybe to put the most essential stuff on one piece of paper and use that as a means of communication throughout the project. What we also will cover on day number 2 is, well, the typical kind of steps, the 4 steps as they are shown here that the architect does on a day-to-day basis. Of course, you need to understand what the problem is about. There it starts off. And maybe you try to visualize that with simple models, maybe on a piece of A3 as a means of communication with your customers and stakeholders. Then how can we come up with solutions? Not only one solution, but maybe multiple propositions. So it's good to not only think in one proposal, but maybe an additional proposal as well, and see how we can weigh them against each other, certain kind of criteria which are of importance for our customers. And then make a choice. What is then the best choice at that moment? That's the decision process. And most important, and not by accident shown here in red, it doesn't stop here. Here it's where it actually starts. We've made a decision, but the decision that we've made, is that also going in the right direction? So we have to monitor, to check, to simulate, to verify, to really see if the choices that we've made are bringing to the table the results that we are expecting. And that will go through a loop several times here. So that covers more or less day number 2. So requirements and the way of working of the architects, and also something about documentation. Let's jump to day number 3. And day number 3 is fully filled with an explanation of the CAFCR framework. It's a bit of a strange word, 5 letters in a row, where each of these letters have one, let's say, representation of one viewpoint, let's say, of the architecture. And they are covering more or less not only what the customer likes to have and how we are going to realize the product, but also asking ourselves, and why are we doing this? So really trying to understand the problem of the customer. That's what the CAFCR framework helps us doing. So this is a slide also from the training, and you see here also these 5 letters, and it often starts here. In day number 2 we started off with requirements for the architect. So what is the customer like to have? What is the functionality that the customer expects? What's the performance that the customer expects from the product? And often we as systems architects jump then into the solution area. If we understand the requirements, we try to come up with maybe an architectural concept, and maybe with technical choices in realization. So we listen to the customer, try to understand what he wants to have, try to understand what he expects from functionality, and jump into the solution area and creating the product. But the CAFCR framework is adding 2 additional views, which you see here on the left-hand side. It invites us, in fact, to ask the question, why? We have these requirements. The customer came with these requirements, with the needs, but why? How will the product be applied in the customer environment? How does the working environment of the customer look like? So what is he doing? How does he do his job? And can we provide him with a solution that even helps our customer doing a better job? And why is he working in that way? That are his objectives, that are his key drivers. So having a bit of an understanding also from this left-hand side of the CAFCR framework can lead to the result that we not just build the product that the customer asked for, but that we come up with the solution that the customer really needs. And that's often very different. And that's what I learned in applying this CAFCR framework, which forces me, or which invites me more or less, not just to listen to the customer and come up with a solution, but from time to time asking myself, and why? Why is he asking this? And do I understand that? And based on that information, I can come up maybe with a better solution in the end. And that's what we, let's say, try to cover in this 3rd day. So here's an example of how I sometimes use it with simple, let's say, flip charts, and trying to cover the various most important elements of the various viewpoints and putting them on the wall. So having them also as a kind of an information radiator for the team and the people that I work with, to have a constant, let's say, kind of automatic feedback from all the people there. And what you do as an architect is more or less reflected here with this purple arrow going from left to the right and right to the left. That's what's happening in the minds, in the heads of the systems architect. We created a kind of a solution, or we made a choice for a certain kind of technology. And why is that? That's because we like to fulfill this concept, this architecture. And why is that? because we have these requirements and these needs. And why is that? Yeah, because the customer needs to have a product that he can apply in his environment. And why is that? Because this is how the customer's business look like. These are his key drivers, his objectives. So the connecting, let's say, lines through this CAFCR framework, that's where the real added value is. Not just filling in, let's say, the separate columns, but trying to connect them together. And that's where the real additional kind of thing is. So that's the part in day number 3. If we go to day number 4, we have in fact also 3 subjects here. Here you see maybe a kind of a very simple, let's say, architecture of a system, a little bit of a block diagram. Yeah, that might be decomposed into parts. You see that here downwards. So maybe we can zoom in on this gray element here, and this is how it looks like. And here it has a circle element. This is how it looks like. So it's decomposing the system into parts. But decomposition is a very important task for the architect. But how to put it all together? How can we integrate it into a successful product? And the main challenges are during the integration process, the integration strategy. So we'll cover that subject. Another subject that we will discuss is the communication that he has to do with lots of people, maybe on a bilateral basis, maybe in a team kind of environment, so the human aspect. And in the afternoon we will cover also something like the roadmap. Maybe you remember from the very first slides that we think of maybe the business drivers often linked to the roadmap of the organization, not building one product but maybe a line of products, and they are linked together. And architectural choices are also very much linked to that process. So let's go to some parts here for the integration strategy. As you might remember that typically the product creation process follows these steps. So we have something like maybe some first feasibility and some needs and some requirements and design and integration and test. And you can have that in a very stepwise approach. The most challenging part is the integration. That's where things come together and where we come to the conclusion that it may not fit mechanically, that electrical signals maybe do not communicate in a correct way, that the software is not interacting good together, and that's typically coming up during this integration phase. So instead of having a very, let's say, blockwise approach of these phases, it might be wise to pull integration as far as possible forward in time for our process. So instead of having it very late in the process, it might be wise to start with integration already in an early phase. Maybe when we think of the decomposition of the system, the architecture, the design, or maybe at requirements level already, to take care of, if we decompose a system in these parts, how will it fit together? So already during the requirements and the definition phase to make choices with integration in the back of our minds. That's how integration becomes not only a part very much in the end of the phases, but also it being addressed in the very early stages of the process. The human aspects that we have to deal with. As an architect, we have to communicate with lots of people. With engineers from various disciplines, maybe with management, maybe with customers, maybe with service, maybe with operators, maybe with financial people. And all these have their own, let's say, way of best communicating with. So communication is a very important task for the architect. That can be bilateral, on a one-to-one basis. That can be in your team, as a group with lots of people. Maybe multidisciplinary, maybe multicultural, various cultures here that come together in teams, but also maybe multi-site, where we have teams of teams spread over the various development sites of the company, and maybe even over countries, and maybe even over the world and over various cultures. And that's where we have to deal with as an architect. How can we get all the people together in the same direction, trying to fulfill the needs that we have and trying to complete the vision that we have for the technology, for the product that we try to deliver. On the fourth day, we also talk about road mapping. And roadmap is typically covering a certain kind of a timeline. We try to look ahead, a couple of years ahead in time. So we're working on one project today, on one product or one system today, but the choices that we made might have impact of the products that are later on the timeline as well. So we have to be aware of, hey, what is technology doing? How is technology evolving over time? What are the technical trends? What kind of technology can I maybe use for products in the future? And that's another layer here in this roadmap. So we do not only think about technology, but how will the technology end up in the products? And for whom? For which markets? What market events? Maybe there are certain kind of shows where we need to show a first prototype. So products, technology and market, but also how about our organization? Do we have the right competences on board? Do we have the right way of working on board? What are the processes of working together in our company? And all these kind of things need to be aligned. So as an architect, you have a very important input for the technology phases, but also be aware of that it will lead to products that can be accepted by the market, and that of course we have the right people on board with the right competences and the right needs there and the right capabilities. So that's what road mapping is about. And the top part are typically driving the lower parts, so the market needs drive also how the organization will be about. And on the other end, the organizational parts like the processes and the competences are the enablers for creating products for that market. So that covers the three subjects of the fourth day. So we talked about system integration strategy, we talked about the human aspects, and we talked about the roadmap. And the fifth day, the last day, is about, hey, how about the business case, the financial aspect of the system, and how can we present that to higher management or to the customer? What are the ingredients of a good presentation to do a good pitch, so to say, for the project that you are responsible for? And the business case, is based on having, at the end, a profitable business. So we have to design a product that has an upfront investment, a lot of, let's say, fixed costs, all kind of development costs, engineering hours that we have to make. And the architect is the one who estimates the amount of effort that it takes to build a product. And once the product is there, maybe we can start selling it. And we see here on the horizontal axis the sales and the sales volume. And we start selling it, we have to produce it. And in the production, we have also the variable cost. And the cost for all the material, all the components, all the assembly that has to be done. So the more products we make, the higher the variable cost will be. On the other hand, of course, we try to sell the products. It's not our task to sell them, it's typically the sales guys that have to do that, and that leads to a certain kind of an income. And the idea, of course, is that the green line has a steeper than the red line here, and in the end it will lead to a certain kind of an income for the organization, a certain kind of a profit. And the business case, and the importance of the business case for the architect is where he has the estimation of the fixed costs, so the upfront engineering cost, but also the components that are part of the system, and what are the cost price of that, and that can lead to either a positive or maybe not a positive business case. And how to be able to convince management, how to convince maybe a customer of the product that you have, how to do that in a good way, how to put a presentation together that can convince the managers, that can convince the customers that the idea that you have are a good idea for their business as well. And we try to also explain how that works. And it's not, let's say, giving a lot of information to the audience in this case, but maybe it boils down to a couple of questions like, hey, what is the problem about? What are the possible propositions that I have? And we have invested into someone, and maybe this is the best advice that we can give here. And have a kind of a presentation put together in that order. Problem, propositions, and maybe an advice to the audience. And maybe you have lots of backup material available as well, and that's shown here on this slide. Maybe you have a lot of material, and maybe you do not show all that material, but we try to also train, let's say, architects in this training that a presentation for management is typically very different than the presentation that you do to, let's say, technical colleagues. Well, that ends, let's say, day number 5, and it all boils down to, teaching our architects that they can come up with, let's say, the right blueprint, but always within the back of our minds that it will bring value for customer, and of course that it will bring value for business, and that's what the architect needs to take up here. I've added some pictures of trainings that I did. We did the trainings several times. We get it together with ITRI in Taiwan. These pictures are not from Taiwan, but from a training in Europe. But what you see here is that we typically have a classroom set up where we can communicate and interact a lot with each other. We also build, let's say, kind of information radiator on the wall. That's what I do as a teacher, to have information directly available and to communicate about it. So this is what we typically cannot do in an online version. This is where you have the real interaction, typically in a classroom version. We have lots of exercises where we split, let's say, the total participants in small groups of 3 or 4 people, where they brainstorm, where they discuss, and where they think about certain kind of exercises and try to work on that on a flip chart. So they discuss about it, and also as a trainer I sometimes come by, maybe answer some questions and give advices on the discussions and the brainstorm sessions that the typical participants have in the session. And at the end, it's also how they present the result to, let's say, the audience. So in the end, we have also, let's say, a kind of a big case running through the full training from day number 1 to the 5th day. And at the last day, all the participants have to present their results. So it's also a kind of a way to enable giving a presentation in a pitch kind of format to the audience, and the audience being the rest of the participants, and how to, let's say, convince the audience of your proposal. As I said, we also have lots of interaction during the training, so it's not just broadcasting me about a subject, it's a lot of, let's say, showing a little bit of theory, but a lot of interaction, sharing experiences from all the participants, doing exercises, and also having a kind of a red line, red thread exercise throughout the full training. And here again a last picture of the classroom setup, which really enables and invites all this interaction. Okay, I hope I've given you a bit of an idea of the systems architecting training, what the elements are, what the ingredients are, how it was built up over the 5 days. I gave you some snapshots of some slides that we are typically using in this training, and it especially focuses on the role of the architect, who has to make decisions, multidisciplinary, but being able to present it not only to technical people but also to the people in his environment. That's his main role. In the end, not just to build what the customer asked for, but what he really needs, and that means that you also as an architect have to invest in the customer environment, trying to understand why these questions of these customer came on the table. So that's what we try to cover. It's not a deep down technical training, it's a training of the role of the architect, the activities that the architect does, architecting, and how he deals with, let's say, his stakeholders in his environment.